Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to UC San Diego's Japan Zoominar. I'm Ulrike Schaede, Professor of Japanese Business here at UC San Diego. I'm also the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. And yes, this finds you at GPS, our School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. If you'd like to know more about us, please visit our website at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. We do a number of things, and if you want to know more about us, please go to jfit.ucsd.edu. When you do that, you end up at something that looks like this, and there are a bunch of tabs on top. There are you can look us up, you can know more about us, and then there's the Japan Zoominars tab. Oops, sorry about that. I wanted to say about the Zoominars. At this tab, you can not only sign up for upcoming events, but also watch past events in our JZ gallery. And yes, that's right. This Zoominar is being recorded. If you go to jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar, you'll find past events. For today, what that means is we'll invite you to type any question you might have into the Q&A box. If I'll read it out, today, I will refer to you only by your first name. The JFIT Japan Zoominar is a regular event. Of course, today we have Sam Gordon, who I will introduce momentarily. But let me tell you that in 2 weeks from now, we'll have Asa Quisenberry, who is the founder and CEO of Skyscape Kabushiki Gaisha, a startup company in Osaka, which is related to flying cars, and in particular, the infrastructure for making your roof a heliport. So this is, and ASA is representing something that's, some people say doesn't exist, namely a very successful startup in Japan in the digital transformation air mobility space. And then later this month, we'll have Mr. Kenko Sone, who is the Consul General of Japan in Los Angeles. He's a wonderful guy, and he'll talk to us about his views and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs views on the geodynamics of the Indo-Pacific. Now, I'll footnote that geodynamics is my word. We haven't really figured out whether we want to talk about politics or economics, and so I did all that. Okay, so let me stop my share and introduce you to Sam. He's right here with me. Hey, Sam. Hello. Good morning in Tokyo.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
So, let me introduce you. Samuel Gordon is a transfer pricing partner at Deloitte Tohmatsu in Japan, a company he joined in 2014. Prior to Deloitte, he was at EY for a large number of years, and Lehman Brothers, not quite as long, and before that at KPMG in both LA and Tokyo. So what that means is he's looking back on 2 decades of working in risk assessment, transfer pricing, M&A, restructuring, and recently mostly taxation, I guess, or more broadly speaking, banking and securities. Sam holds a BA in, I believe it was PEIS, but I'm not sure, Northeast Asia Political Economy from UC Berkeley. Go Bears, go Cal. And more importantly, possibly, a Masters of International Affairs from GPS, our school. And Sam, I'll add on, even though that dates us a little bit, that you were my student at some point, hard to believe, in the previous century. And I remember that you did a class project on Danone yogurt or something. I don't know why I remember this, but I also remember that you were driving around in an orange Volkswagen Beetle.
That's right.
So there are these memories, right? And I don't know why I remember that, but you were a great student then, and you're very successful, and we're of course very proud of you having such a great career. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So the topic we're talking about is this never-ending story of Japan saying that it would be nice if Tokyo were Asia's financial center. And I think it goes all the way back to the bubble years in the 1980s, and then came Prime Minister Hashimoto's Big Bang, which was supposed to make Japan finds free, fair, global, something like that. And here we are 20 years later, we're still talking about free, fair, global, and center. So I thought, Sam, it'd be great if we have a little bit of a conversation about why that is not so, or what's in the way, or why this is even something that one would want. So, so I understand you brought some PowerPoint. So why don't we lay out what your thoughts are on the topic?
Sure. Give me a minute and I'll get the technology up here and make sure we get this correct in. Let me know if you can see my slides. Sorry, just get this showing in the right way. So you're right. This is a long-held discussion, right, about Tokyo, in particular Tokyo, Japan more broadly, but Tokyo as a financial services hub. And I think you're right, Schaede-sensei, when you first ask the question why, right? And I think it's important to kind of level set around that. And what do we mean when we say a financial services hub, right? There's a lot of different connotations and ways of thinking about that. I mean, at the core of it, though, is, concentration of financial services firms, capital, expertise, activity in a location, right? And then what does financial services do, right? It's about what we call intermediation, which is a very complicated way of saying bringing things together in the best way possible to serve certain needs, and market making, right? And then it obviously involves some risk taking, and that's where some of the downsides can come in, as we've known over time, right? The volatility associated with financial services, and what we saw yesterday, I think, in the U.S. with the banking failure. Then there's what type of financial services hubs, and this is really important as we go through the conversation. There's Tokyo in particular has always been a real economy-backed kind of hub, right? And it's always been important to the domestic economy, and the scale of the Japanese economy has been important to that. There's also what we call sort of information knowledge sharing hubs, right? You can think of, take the Lloyd's market in London, for example, right? Very unique, very important set of information used globally. And then there's financial intermediary hubs, which are Singapore, New York, London. They play multiple roles, but they play these roles vis-a-vis other markets, right? So they intermediate capital exchange and matchmaking for markets globally. And then finally, there's gateway types of hubs. And increasingly, when you think about the hubs in Greater China, these hubs tend to be thought of as more gateway hubs, gateways for particular to an economic region, geography, that kind of a thing. The benefits are pretty straightforward, right? The kinds of things that most ministries of finance, ministries of economics, prime ministers aspire to, right? Employment, better use of capital, the strategic benefits associated with all of the activity and networks and things that come along with this. And obviously Japan is a financial services hub. The question, as you said, is much more, where is it relative to others, given the scale of Japan and the scale of Tokyo, right? And why is that the case, right? And where is Japan going? I think in terms of the competitive landscape, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. And one is clearly, and this is the one that we hear in the news quite often, everybody or people who are familiar with Japan at least quite often hear about the size and scale of financial assets that underpin the Japanese economy, right? Whether that be consumer deposits, whether that be the market capitalization of exchanges here, whether it be the government private pension investment funds, which are some of the largest fishes in the investment management world, right? All of these things we hear about. And so that's what makes, that's the appeal, I would say. And that is where Japan obviously already is a financial services hub, but it's a question of effectiveness, right? And what is being achieved. And The areas that Japan is less, I would say, is challenged is with respect to circulation of some of those, and the effectiveness with which capital gets allocated, or perceived effectiveness with which capital gets allocated. I know some of your books have emphasized some of the other types of business objectives that Japan, that's inherent to Japan's model of capitalism, right? So we can't short sight those, but when we talk about a financial services hub, the idea of relatively low circulation of deposits, the idea of relatively low loan to bank deposit ratios, a relatively underdeveloped investment management sector, right? These kinds of things, particularly relative to other financial services hubs in Asia, right, call into question the ranking or position of Japan. And when we think about the positioning, right, I mean, part of that is maybe, I don't want to use the word public relations, but part of that is, presenting yourself a certain way to the world. Part of that is, the underlying data that arguments can be made around where companies rank. And one pretty common ranking over the last few years has been done by Yin, a UK-based think tank, and it's now in its 33rd year of presenting the Global Financial Center Index, and it looks at a number of different competitive factors or areas: business environment, human capital, infrastructure, financial service development, reputation. And bottom line is Japan has, over the last 15 years, continued to go down in ranking in that context, right? It's currently at 21 in the ranking overall. And then there are now, let me see, four, at least, maybe, 4 or 5 APAC hubs that outrank Japan. And you say to yourself, is Japan then on a path towards its stated goal of being a key financial services hub for APAC? So if in fact, we take that ranking, and again, we take that with a grain of salt, and we know the magnitude of the markets here are very significant. What then is in play in terms of Japan improving its position? Clearly, there's the market element of it, the choices that firms make and that investors and players in financial services make. But there's also important to note the political economy aspect of this, right? i.e. the role of the state, the role of agency, the role of what I call collaborators in the public space, right? And how they're influencing and trying to either enable or serve as a headwind to meeting these goals. I think in Japan, the Schaede administration has been very, very clear about its carrying on the mantle of other Prime Minister era calling for this. And it was just a couple of days ago, Schaede-san was very specific in that he suggested the asset manager reforms are needed in Japan. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And he's instructed the FSA to be very, very specifically involved in this. I think the FSA has taken a role of trying to address transactional cost issues and tax, setup of companies, financial regulations, these kinds of things are important there. And Governor Koike, she's been a big proponent of this for Tokyo as the head of the Tokyo metropolitan government. And then they're trying to focus more on startup promotion, on collaboration and exchange, and on coordination with the central government around these transactional cost issues. Finally, the Fin City Tokyo represents, it's kind of the culmination or the cross between, you can think of as what's occurring at the FSA and at the metropolitan government level, where it is the members are largely financial services firms, both traditional and non-traditional startups, even academics, research institutes to try to bring together the right public-private kind of groupings and create the clusters and networks necessary to bring some vibrancy and focus on key areas of financial services in Tokyo. So I think that there is, and when we think about the competitive landscape, the other countries in APAC are very much more focused on it from, I think, the city-states are focused on it from a monetary authority perspective in particular. And the clusters are obviously a lot easier to formulate when you're talking about the scale of a Singapore or Hong Kong relative to the scale of Japan and Tokyo. Shanghai is very unique in its very specific role as a gateway hub, right? And that gateway hub position increasing vis-a-vis Hong Kong with some of the changes that are occurring, I think, politically and legally and risk-wise with respect to Hong Kong. Jason, maybe I'll stop here and see if you have any comments or questions before I go on to the next. I've got maybe just a couple other points to make on a couple other slides. I don't know if there's anything of note that jumps off the page for you at this point.
I muted myself. I was trying to. So sorry about that.
I thought it was me.
Yeah. So this is super interesting, and I think we're all very interested in hearing what you think are the reasons why Tokyo's holding back. But before we go there, maybe one quick question, and that is, what is so desirable about being a financial hub, right? I mean, is this just a story about money, or would it make the yen, more important or something? What are the benefits? I mean, you laid out the costs, right? So you get the volatility, you bring in dog-eat-dog capitalism, you allow Wall Street to play their games. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why one would not want this.
Right.
What are the reasons why Koike-san in particular is so interested in bringing this back up now?
I think there's two, broadly speaking. The first one is, and I think, in the US, right, we often hear the term creative destruction. I don't know if that's the right word to use for Japan, because I don't think that it would take that form. But this idea of how do you make best use of assets, and how do you facilitate the process of making sure the economy evolves in a way that makes it more productive. The common view of financial services is, as you state, right, this sort of very dog-eat-dog kind of world that's focused in a way on arbitrage and on return to shareholders solely. That is the view that Koike-san and the Japanese government hope that it aligns with meeting certain social goals. In other words, the use of finance to drive the goals that other goals, right, that are wide social economic. And I think that we've always seen that in financial services. It's a question of degree. I think that's the big, and the other is productivity that you tend to see in places, clusters of financial services firms.
So it fits into Kishida, Prime Minister Kishida's new form of capitalism there, where they have this big point of the more efficient uses of redistribution of assets and so forth, I guess. I'm not quite sure.
Well, I think that's right. For example, the other area it fits into, as if we think about environment, social, society, and governance, ESG, the ESG initiatives and motivation that we see, particularly with respect to climate change, right? Everyone realizes there has to be a certain market dynamic that starts to be employed to incentivize the cost and the return and the value involved starts to permeate more broadly through the economy. And we look at the areas of focus that Kishida-san has mentioned with respect to sustainability and Tokyo Green, and we look at what Governor Koike's son has been involved in. Those areas, for example, those new areas of where environmental objectives, right, is a great example of an area where they would hope to have some achievements going forward. And it's a new space, right? It's a space that no one location can currently lay claim to being, a clear head and above leader. And there's a real economy-based need for it as well. So those kinds of things.
Hiroki has a question of whether Japanese banks and my guess is he means that broadly. So financial players need to be more competitive to make Tokyo more attractive.
And I think some of the points in this very strategic analysis of Japan kind of get at that. I mean, there's long been an appreciation for how traditional and limited, and even though they represent a massive scale, the insurance industry has been here, right? The life insurance industry. They represent absolutely, massive in terms of scale, but they're not at the cutting edge of the insurance industry, I would say globally. Those kinds of things are areas where I think, when we think about financial services, right, it really, in a way, has to also include the investment management part of the world. Increasingly, we see them taking on roles that previously maybe were largely thought of as banking roles, right? And so I think that their hope is, or one of the big hopes is that focusing on the investment management world will help improve that circulation of capital, the allocation of capital, the use of capital in a way that they're not really seeing necessarily currently from the traditional banking sector, right? And that is a need for insurance, right? In a way, it's more of a need. Insurance firms actually need a good investment management sector to realize their business objectives. So I think that there's a play between, when we think about the three sectors involved, right? It's the IM sector where Japan is probably the weakest, despite what I mentioned about banking and insurance. And that has been when we think about the areas of focus, I think that's a massive area of focus that all of the players in the political economy are realizing and are trying to foster.
So Sam, let me suggest I don't know whether it's on my end, on your end, we're having some slight interruptions in the Wi-Fi. So why don't we finish your PowerPoints and then turn those off, and that might actually increase the quality of our exchange here. So let's see what else you got.
Okay,
sure. We're still waiting for you to tell us why Tokyo is not getting this done, right? So
yeah, I think this kind of gets into it. When we think about why, it has to do with probably some of the weaknesses, and I would say up to now some of the missed opportunities that we've had. I mean, the strength of the Japanese Financial Services Center is really, in a way, its scale. And it's interesting, I think an increasing strength is the banking sectors and corporate sectors' outward focus, right? When we think about how focused they are on global markets, they've had to be that way given the lack of growth domestically. And in the near term, the strength of the government agencies, the political economy focus on this. I think the reason Japan has not been as successful maybe as other regional hubs is there's what I call an ex-Japan conundrum, Asia ex-Japan conundrum. And this is where I can bring in a little bit of my own personal experience. I've been involved in APAC related financial services, largely Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore for the greater part of 15, 20 years. And I was in Singapore 2 weeks ago. And when I visited, even to this date, the conversations when people talk about Asia from that part of the world, they talk about the rest of Asia and they talk about Japan somewhat separately. So that's the Asia ex-Japan conundrum. And there's reasons for that. I think part of it is just the dynamic of where the economic growth comes from in Asia and the focus around certain gateways, the gateway to Southeast Asia, the gateway to China, right? Which Japan has more of a limited presence in, given its historical, particularly financial services positioning. I think the other area that there's a risk aversion, and it's one of the interesting articles I read in the Nikkei Weekly was around how well positioned Japanese corporates were for COVID, given the mountains of cash that they were holding, right? That they were not deploying in what some folks would say in an efficient manner. One could say that was held as an insurance. The other could say it was held because of, particularly low risk appetites, right? And I don't know if that's something that can be easily fixed, but it clearly is one of the reasons why you don't see the level of circulation that you see in other places, right? And you don't see the unlocking of the massive cash holdings, right, that we see in Japan. So those to me are really two of the big weaknesses. It's not, I don't focus per se on the human capital side of it or the business environment side of it. There are limits there, there are issues there, but having lived in Tokyo and been here for long enough, I have an appreciation. I think most people have an appreciation for how stable it is, how the depth of talent that is available in the market and the depth of talent that's willing to be in this market and come to this market if needed, right? So those to me are secondary things to Japan's positioning vis-a-vis the rest of Asia and this risk aversion or risk appetite is probably the better way to put it. So if we have that, then the question becomes, what are areas that Japan can focus on, right, on a go forward basis, right, for its competitive positioning, right? I think one important one is to focus on its sphere of influence, given the potential decoupling of the global economy, and this is very much a political economy, international affairs driven point, right? Clearly, we see, Japan's real economy is, very dependent on supply chains, very oriented towards deep supply chain connections and distribution around the world. And its connections to the West are very deep, right? I think those cross-regional ties need to be thought of in a different way for financial services purposes and fostered. I think that's occurring now, but it's important that be the case. The other is in region. There's certain market making activity that Japan is well placed to continue and has always been very, very strong in. I think as far as U.S. Treasuries and how they get traded in the APAC region. And Japan's transparency, stability, and scale, right, are critical. Also, the yen as a reserve currency might be taking it a bit too far, but it's definitely important that the importance of the yen vis-a-vis the decoupling is to be thought about. The other is the leaning into the differentiation on value versus growth, right? The other Asian markets are largely a growth play, right? China, we don't know how long that will be the case, but it's largely a capital growth play. I think Japan, when we think about just in the last few weeks, some of the articles around some of the major foreign investment management houses kind of being bullish on Japan, it's because they call Japan cheap right now. Part of it is yen, part of it is the valuation of shares. And that has to do with the quality of income that they foresee versus the current prices. Emphasizing those kinds of things are important. I think the TSE has been moving on improving the rules and regulations to incentivize listed companies to focus more on ROE. And I think there are some very good lessons that can be learned from some of the high value sectors in Japan, trading companies, for example, and they're changing their business models. And the intersection of that with some of the M&A activity and the private equity activity is a massive area to explore more, I think, in terms of value. The third item, focusing on a highly productive investment management ecosystem. I say ecosystem because it has to be corporates, it has to be the government pension funds, and it has to be the advisors coming together. One story I can share, Schaede can say is, I deal with a lot of asset management clients. And one of the issues that they face here in Japan is, they have fluctuations in AUM. If their AUM goes down and their earnings go down, and they find themselves in a situation for even just a Japanese subsidiary, they're in a loss-making position, they can be kept out of the RFPs for the government pension fund AUM that's in play. And that's understandable, but there's some disconnects between the idea of you want to grow the IM market, yet you have these scenarios where you expect in every market situation for players to be positive all across the board. I think that's important to think about. The last is, I think we need to foster, continue to foster a transparent M&A and spinoff market. I think there's been a lot of progress in this space over the last 10, 15 years in Japan, but that is unlocking a significant amount of value. Private equity may have a role in that. I think, we all know about the recent Toshiba deal. There are tons of deals like that, right? Spinoffs that are occurring. And I know your book looks into that, and a lot of the ways Japan wants to do that may be different from the way it is done in the West, but nonetheless, I think there's a massive market there for that needs to continue to be looked at. The green financing area and digitalization are obvious green spaces, no pun intended, that Japan also has to focus on going forward. I'll stop here, and I know I've talked a lot, and I can turn off my shares now, so excuse me, my slides now, to maybe help us have more of a conversation.
Oh, great, thank you. So, so I asked this question a lot, right? So, why is this not? And some of the answers that I get are related also to language. In fact, Bronwyn
yes.
has that question. The Bronwyn's question is, what are the linguistic factors involved in Asia, Japan? Then there's the red tape. You started talking about that a little bit. Like to become a hedge fund in Japan is like crazy stuff, right? Yeah. And then maybe also taxation.
Yep. Yep.
So let's go down into the weeds just a little bit and add a couple of things of what's so difficult?
What's at play in those areas? Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say about those areas are, maybe I'll just use tax as an example. It's really important that we don't let the tail wag the dog. Okay. These kinds of issues are really, really critical issues. But as we've seen in other markets, if there are significant opportunities and there's a business model to be made or business case to be made, financial services firms are very ingenious at getting around these kinds of issues. So let's make that clear. I think I group tax and what do you call it? Company setup, governance setup. Let's kind of group those as what we call transactional cost areas, right? And there is, I think, the ease with which obtaining licenses, registering companies, those kinds of things, that has kind of been convoluted with business culture and language issues here in Japan, right? Because for so long that those processes have done only the process that you could do in Japanese. And I think the FSA, this is the one space that the FSA has really, really been focused on. Now, there's a question of scale and how much can the FSA do. They are actually working closely with with what I understand to be some of the professional services firms that are focused around assisting startups. right? And they are trying to make these processes easier. So that is, I think, the issue with there. The tax side of it is an interesting one, right? There has long been concern with both the corporate tax rate and on the and certain points within the corporate tax rules, deductions of certain types of expenses, the treatment of what we call carry in the private equity context, for example. And then on the individual side, the inheritance tax. Maybe I can just kind of anecdotally share what I hear, right, on the tax side, just very simply. The corporate tax issue is much more of an issue with respect to the location of significant operations. It is not necessarily an issue with respect to the deployment of capital. And we have to distinguish the two in a way, right? The deployment of capital is, as I mentioned in the first instance, if there is return that is meets the requirements, folks will go after it, right? So there's an attractiveness that has to be there fundamentally first, right? And I think what I focused on has been more the attractiveness of the Japanese market and where would that either value or growth come from. The way tax reforms occur in Japan is through, obviously, you know this, Schaede Sensei, with other types of stuff, study groups, the proliferation of study groups, right? But the importance here is that there has increasingly been, both the NTA, National Tax Administration Agency, and then the FSA sit in the Ministry of Finance. And there's increasingly been input from FSA study groups that do include private sector and advocates within the FSA around these areas. So we have seen, for example, in M&A tax, the ability to get through what we kind of consider to be qualified mergers that are non-taxable, right? The appreciation that you need to be on a level playing ground with respect to how carry is treated in investment management space. These things have made their way into reforms. I would also say that you can expect that the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore will be in flux around tax with the introduction of the minimum tax regimes, the global minimum tax regimes that are occurring. So, you know, this is not just the Japan dynamic as well. It's the relative dynamic of them. The English one, I'm always struck by that. Maybe it's because I've been here too long, Schaede Sensei, but I have never really found that to be an impediment to business. It's a preference, and it's a way you operate point. And I do think the underlying side of that might be the cultural connectivity that Singapore and Hong Kong have with certain places in the West, right? And their established relationships are different from, let's call it, the US-Japan dynamic versus the UK, Hong Kong, UK, Singapore dynamic. I think there's an element of that plays out. And so I take that language thing to be more of a workaround than a real impediment to doing business. I would love to debate it with somebody over a drink at some point.
Yeah, that strikes me as an iiwake, right? As an excuse.
Yeah.
Because you know, I'm certainly in the time of deep L, and the forms are only in Japanese. So well, you're doing business in Japan, so get over.
Yeah, and I think you know, I think that if we compare Japan, I think the speaking of English is probably more extensive in China, but I don't know that dealing with regulatory authorities is any easier in China, where you have currency controls. Now, the amount of direct involvement of foreign players in Shanghai has not been as high as it has been in Hong Kong. However, like I said, that's something most people think that's in flux right now. That's very much in flux, right? So that, again, Japan relative to these places has these, I think, some opportunities. It just has to unlock some of its potential, right? No matter how slow it seems to the rest of the world with respect to financial assets and incentivization for players in the market domestically.
So we have clusters of questions around three topics that I want to ask you about. One has to do with policy changes within Japan. Then there are some regulatory questions that are very interesting that I want to read out. And the third one would maybe we'll kind of wind up ending on that. It's a little bit of what a measure of success would be. So let me start. Yeah, let me start with the first, which is actually, and I'm sure he has no problem being announced here since he's been on the show a lot. Your former professor Takeo Hoshi. Yeah. So, and he says you very nice presentation, so that you get an A. His question is, why do you put the possibility of Bank of Japan policy change as a threat rather than
I think
opportunity? Right. So let me read it here. The many argue that the BOJ policy has been hurting the functions of financial markets. Isn't it good news that the BOJ may be winding down their QQE?
I think it is. I think in the longer term it is, but in the immediate, the issue of the change in the mark to market on assets will be it doesn't represent an opportunity, right? I mean, I think it gets to the point on value. I think that, if you think of Japan as a value market, if there's an intrinsic value that you expect to be relatively stable, right, for these assets, then yes, right, and will over time, over the longer time, I think it's a reckoning that has to come, right? So it's it's a threat in terms of if it's not managed well, right, it can be problematic. And I think, when we think about let's think about what's occurring in the US, what's occurred with the banks there, as you've seen, a step up in interest rates, right? It's been a question of risk management, the impact of mark-to-markets, and how that flows through. So that to me is where the threat part of it is. I do think intrinsically there is significant value that can be unlocked there that has to be kind of coupled with that.
So I think that this is always happening, right? That people think, here's a window of opportunity. Now something is happening. And I've heard that a lot, right? So Japan is finally interesting again. Inflation is arriving. There's some movement, right? So there may be some end of the stagnation. But then things happen. And that's actually, there was one question is from Kevin. This goes into the FSA regulatory regime area. Kevin is wondering, what will the impact be of Trevor Hill's arrest while he was at NBC Nikko Securities? And he's wondering whether financial firms globally will view the FSA regulatory actions as parochial or not global. And I like this question especially for Trevor, maybe Trevor, but there is the sense that the FSA is slow, is parochial, is very domestic oriented.
It's interesting, right? The FSA since the demise of Lehman Brothers has been one of the more predictable regulators. One, it did not go through as much of a hand-wringing with respect to the regulatory change that it needed to make in response to the GFC. Two, it has continually, I'd say, going back to a couple of generations in terms of leadership there, they have continued to emphasize an expanded role of the FSA in not just financial stability, but the importance of economic growth. And they have moved more towards a principled approach to reviews. Now, anybody who knows Japan, that has to be put in a cultural lens of, being very komokai and being very, very detail oriented. That's just the nature of operating here. The specific case of the Nikko case, and I've only been privy to what's in the news media about it. But when we look at the traits and the situation around it, the first thing there is I think that that particular firm was a late comer into a market space that everyone else had already left out of. So it was an outlier, relative to many of its peers in terms of where it was and how it was positioning itself in some of its activity. The second was, my understanding is that the activity with the regulators went on for a very long time prior to what became the public maelstrom, right, and arrests and everything. And like is often the case, right? I think there were earlier opportunities. I mean, there's a way in which you handle these regulatory audits and the way you navigate these things that, it begs the question of, well, how well was this handled? Now, the one element of this, I think, that's being conflated with the regulatory aspect of it is just, the overall, probably Japan's overall criminal justice, approach to criminal justice and handling of its ability to hold people, right? Which is, I think, something distinct from the FSA. Once you've gotten into a position of being on the back foot, you enter a new world. So I don't know that to me does not represent a particular trend, right? And if we think across the sector, when we think about what are the regulators focused on right now, for example, in terms of activity, they're focused on the potential mis-selling of AT1 capital. So these convertible capital, for example, the Credit Suisse convertible capital that got marked to zero, right, as a result of its bankruptcy. In a retail context, right? Was that done improperly in a marketplace where there's an expectation of less sophistication, right, of buyers, right? So that to me seems like a perfectly suitable kind of a thing for them to look at. So I don't think topically or trend wise that represented a particular path we're seeing the FSA kind of pursue overly aggressively. That would be my view. I again, over a drink, Kevin, I would love to debate if you happen to be in Tokyo.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether the FSA is getting too much of a bad rap. I think initially when they started out in 1998, they didn't quite know what they were doing, but they have come around, I think, a long way. To just say that the FSA is kind of an outlier in terms of regulating agencies strikes me as a little bit.
And again, when we think about Japan's relative, the idea that the FSA is going to be on a scale with a city-state regulator is not a real point of comparison, right? If you were to compare it to the US regulators, maybe, right? Would you, and even the UK regulator is a different type of regulator, given the type of financial service hub the UK is, right? The FSA is more concerned about Japan as a real economy backing the domestic economy financial service hub, right? These other places, with the exception of the U.S., right, that's not the first order of business quite often. Or it's important, don't get me wrong, but it's not the majority of what you would expect for the Singapore regulators to be concerned with, for example. So I think that dynamic has to be appreciated, given the scale of the Japanese economy and the FSA's role for the overall Japanese domestic economy. It has to be balanced against that.
So let's move on to this question of success. So there's actually 3 questions, and they're all excellent. So let me heap it upon you, all of them. It would seem, Robert thinks, that the percentage of total financial transactions in a nation that are done by foreign entities might be a compelling measure of whether or not, a country could be called a financial hub. Do you have any ideas what that would look like? And how it compares? So that's one. So how do we even measure? And I do know that most of the trades at the Japan JPX are done by foreigners, but is that the right measure, right? Or is it where the money comes from? Let me consider. That's one. So now I'm looking for Adam. Adam asks, regional financial center is a vague concept. What metrics would you use if you don't use the one that
Yeah.
Robert has suggested. Competitiveness, size of financial firms, introduction of regional marketing, products, technologies, amount of financial transactions occurring in Japan, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
And Jenny tops it off and says, this is super interesting to hear about Tokyo as an APAC financial hub. What would Tokyo look like if it overcame those shortcomings? That is, if Tokyo were to succeed, what differences would we see?
Yeah, I think that's the best. I think that's the easier angle to come at. How do you'll know success when you see it, kind of a thing. I think to picking up on the last point to start with, I think the first thing you would probably see is you would see more news clippings, like a recent one. I think it was in December, or no, it's in the last quarter or so, that said, hey, the amount of share buybacks had increased significantly in Japan. And the reason being is companies were saying, we can't deploy this capital. Well, we could give it back to the dividend, but we'll do it in a share buyback, right? So this idea of freeing up the amount of cash that's sitting on corporate balance sheets first, right? That's one, I think, right? I also think that if you look at Japan's the foreign assets, right? The foreign financial assets that tend to be held, they're highly concentrated. They're all over, but they're more concentrated in the advanced markets, economy markets, particularly U.S. and Europe. I think a better distribution of that in terms of APAC assets being held. You can see that there's a certain amount of that's going to occur with from an FDI perspective, given changes in supply chains that are coming, right? But will the financial assets kind of also reflect that, right? I think that's the second one that I would look to as an indicator, right? And then I think the third one is, if the TSE has made some changes to the tiers and the focus on ROE, and if we start to see improvements in ROE that then translate into improvements in market capitalization, or that to me would be the other one as well, right? I don't know that we're going to see a massive change in banking activity, right? So I'm focusing on, if you notice, I'm focusing primarily on investment activity, more so than banking activity at this point. I think the banking sector has other challenges, to Hoshi Sensei's point, what that will play out as a result of what occurs with the BOJ. And I don't want to sort of read those tea leaves if I don't have to.
So we want to go back to the transactions, but I think you just said something that I think is driving a lot of, basically the answer to my earlier question about what's the benefit of being a hub. I think part of what's driving this, maybe it's just a cynic in me, but I would thought what was driving all of this is the realization that the JPIF, this massive domestic pension fund, needs higher ROE and a bigger market cap. This is not about altruistic or saving the world or reputation. It is just show me the money. We need higher returns on our pensions. We can't risk putting our pensions into New York and London and whatnot. We need to keep them in yen because we have a fiduciary duty to our pensioners. So can somebody please introduce some circulation into the Japanese financial market so that we earn higher returns?
That's right. You need the more circulation in the Japanese market, and you need a more efficient swap market from an FX standpoint. To the degree you need to kind of address the volatility in that space, because they do. You look at the amounts that they invest in foreign assets, and they're massive by any other standard. They're small relative to the overall portfolios, right? But the big holdback on that has always been, like you said, the FX risk, right? That they have to deal with, and the cost of hedging that risk, right? So you're absolutely right? That's absolutely. The investment management point is driven off of that, and off of, we've got all this money sitting in these corporates, and we're not we're not effectively using it, right? Those things to me are investment management issues more so than pure banking issues. I would think. I can you the first question you asked was about foreign companies and their the level of transactions. This is an interesting one, Schaede, and I'll expound upon this a little because this is exactly the world that I'm in, right? In terms of some of the specific work I do. These global financial services hubs represent locations where transactions occur, risk is taken, but that risk doesn't necessarily always have to sit. It doesn't always sit and stay in those markets, right? Just by virtue of the way capital flows occur, the way what we call booking of transactions themselves occur. So I don't know that those are necessarily a measure immediately of, the front end transactions are a measure of the economic impact, right, of the transactions in a given market because of all that occurs behind there. I think the increase of foreign activity in the investment management space, the AUM, increasing AUM of investment managers, because there's a lack of sort of real, I would say, there aren't a significant number of very globally well-positioned investment managers that are based out of Japan, right? So that to me is the canary in the coal mine point, right? If we can start to see that increase, I think you'll start to see more competition for the creation of Japanese investment management firms as well, right? But I think that's going to have to occur. It's going to have to be triggered, right, by something in that ecosystem, as I mentioned, that investment management ecosystem.
So we have time for the final question, and I always like to ask the one that Professor Hugh Patrick, my mentor, said it gives you great answers, although it tends to get us out of here on a sour note. So I'm going to ask you, what are you worried about most in terms of Tokyo's role as a financial center, and then maybe to end on a high note, what do you think?
I think my biggest concern is probably the handling of the decoupling, and how the extent to which the decoupling will actually occur. Right, we already see this as more of a, like I said, a political economy thing that is trickling into private markets, right? How extensive will that be? How disruptive will that be? And how will Japan react, given, and you and I have both studied Japan for a long time. When Japan needs to move quickly, it can do so, but it has to build its way up to that, right? There's this sort of, crescendo that has to occur, and will Japan sort of mistime that, right, in terms of how this decoupling occurs? That to me is the broader theme that is going to drive, because again, Japan is always going to be a real economy-backed financial services. So it's never going to be your intermediary. We have a bunch of trading coming in from offshore for just for arbitrage reasons. It's never going to be that. So that very real issue is probably my biggest concern, how Japan handles that. I think Schaede-san and the Prime Minister Schaede and others have done a good job so far, right? And politically positioning. How that then extends is going to be, and what that means in private markets is going to be important going forward.
Wow, that's a great way to wrap this up, Sam. This was wonderful. Thank you, Samuel Gordon from Deloitte Tohmatsu Japan was with us this hour, and thank you, audience, for joining us. Come back in 2 weeks. We're going to talk flying cars and venture capital and Japan's innovation startup system. So it'll be a somewhat related topic, in fact. So thank you, Sam. It was great to see you, and keep up the good work. And
good to see you too.
Stay in touch.
Good to see you too. Look forward to seeing you next time you're in Tokyo.
All right.
All right.
Take care, everybody, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.